we're going to be working with negative space painting today. So I thought I would try to just explain that concept for those of you who are new to painting or new to that idea. And just so you understand, because this is a really helpful concept when we're working with watercolors. Watercolors are a translucent medium. So that means that, you're layering and you can see the colors underneath. So you really do have to plan a little bit when you're choosing what to put on your canvas, when and what order. And to think of negative space can be very, very helpful for lots of different projects, especially if you have a cluster of things. Now, what I mean by negative space. So this is the subject of this particular picture is the bird. So if we were thinking of things in terms of shapes, the shape of the bird is the positive space. That's the positive image that we are working with. So the negative space is what's behind it. So if we were trying to, for example, fill in this blue color, we would be painting the negative space around the subject, which is the bird. This is a lot more complicated. We have several different subjects going on here. We have the turtle, but what I want to point out is when you look at the trees, because sometimes we think of negative space as darker than the subject, but that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes the negative space is a highlight behind something. So in this case, the positive would be the tree roots, and then the negative would be the white space behind it. We wouldn't be painting white space if the background is white. We don't have to paint that, right? Because the page is white. So in this case, we would be focusing on painting the subject, the positive image. But if we were trying to paint around something that's lighter, for example, this branch here, this is lighter, so we would want to put in pigment around that to bring out that shape. So it's really your when you paint, you have to go kind of from light to dark. And in order to highlight things that are light, we sometimes have to put in a darker pigment around it. And that's true for, let's say, if we were doing a cluster of leaves. Some of the leaves are closer to the light source, so they're going to be brighter and lighter. And then some leaves are going to be darker, and then some are going to be darker still. So by doing these layers of negative painting, we can create that effect. And that's what I'm going to show you how. That's the project we're going to work on today. Let me do an example of if we were going to do it in positive painting first, just so you kind of see what I mean and the difference. I'm going to be doing just circles because they're easy and I have these templates. You can also just use a round jar or something that you can trace around, or caps, bottle caps or cups or whatever, if you're going to follow with circles. But you can do any shape you want. You can do organic leaf shapes. It doesn't matter the shape. We're going to just try to be consistent with the shapes, different sizes, but the same shape, just to simplify. I'm also going to use just one pigment color, and I'm going to be doing various values, and values mean light to dark. So I'm going to be doing it monochromatic, meaning it's one color, and then I'm going from light shades to darker shades. You can do this effect with mixed colors, as long as you keep in mind the value. And here's an example of what I mean by value. So this is light to dark value. So you always want to work from light to dark, and then it continues all the way to the deepest shade. So that's what I'm going to be doing, but with just one color. So if I was going to approach a project and I wanted to focus on the positive shape of it, what I would do is it's kind of going to look a little bit like I'm going to start off like I would with my other project here. I'm just going to draw in some different circles. So if I'm focusing on painting the positive space, that means I'm going to paint the subject. And in this case, the subject is the circle. And I'm starting with just a real watered down, I don't have a lot of pigment in there, real watered down mix. Now you could mix up some different levels, different values of your paint ahead of time. But because this does take a little bit of time, it starts to dry out. So you kind of have to add water, which sort of defeats the purpose of having it all perfectly done. mixed ahead of time. But basically, I'm going to be trying to have, less pigment, more water, and then add a little more pigment and a little bit more pigment. But even if I just layered the same value of pigment over the top, it would still add some pigment. So it would still deepen the colors as I went along. So I'm going to do my best to gradually add more and more pigment. And it's not a science, so it can be a little tricky. You can have a little sample paper that you try out your color. Just remember that it dries lighter than it is when you first put it down. Okay, so in positive space painting, I'm painting the circles. My next step would be to dry those. In this case, we do have to dry every single layer for this technique to work. And that's true when we're working with watercolor. There are times we really have to let it be dry in order to, because if you work near something that's wet, it's going to drag that pigment across to it. So I'm going to just dry it with a hair dryer. So now I'm going to do my next step, and this is what I'm going to be doing with the other project too. I'm just going to start adding some additional circles randomly. And you'll notice I'm not going over the top of the other circle. I'm going behind it. Now, in this case, I could go above it because I'm going with darker paint, but it's still going to show where those intersections are. It's not going to be seamless because I'm going to have layered paint there. So in order just to not have that layered paint effect, I'm going to just go behind it. So this circle is underneath the top circle. So now I'm going to just try to get a little bit more pigment in my mix, not that much. If you get too much, you just add more water. And that can be one of the biggest challenges with watercolor, is learning that balance of, water to pigment. But that just takes time and experience. So just play around with it. So now I'm going to go to the positive space of the next circle. I just want you to have a clear idea of, because both of these techniques are helpful and can be used, but they give you a different outcome. And it just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and dry this. Now I'm going to go a little bit more pigment. Okay, and I can clean up those edges around them, and then I could just keep doing that. I could keep creating more darker and darker circles and fill up this whole thing with these different shades. And you can see these kind of look like they're up higher. I could even create some shadows underneath there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but this is when I'm focusing on painting only the positive space. Now we're going to do the opposite of this. All right, so here's my regular page, and I'm just going to draw in some circles. So in this case, I am not going to ever be painting inside this circle. I'm going to leave some pure white. So basically, normally I would just do a really light layer, and then I would have those be my lightest layer, but I think I'm going to leave these ultra white, and then I can, so that they really pop. So I'll do it that way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to paint around these circles. I'm painting everything except for inside the circle. Okay. The circles will remain white in this layer. So I want my lightest mix. Try to get rid of this like real concentrated. Move that over. And I'm going to go around the circles. In this case, you're never going into any of the circles. And if you want to have your top layer of circles a color, you could just do an all over color and then draw your circles. That's fine, but I went ahead and drew the circles, so I'm going to let them be white. And I picked indigo because it has a nice dark value when you get to the pure pigment. And you can do any color, but just keep in mind that, for example, if you did yellow, I mean, you just have to think about how, oops, got a little too much pigment. You just have to think about how dark can you get that, how much contrast you're going to get. And this will give me a lot more contrast. Okay, so I have I don't know why I did this at all, but it's going to dry a little lighter. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and dry this layer. All right, now I'm going to go in and just like I did with when I was doing the positive painting, I'm going to go in and create some more circles behind the other circles. Once again, I am not going to paint inside any of the circles. So now I'm only going to fill in all the space around it, and I can add a little bit more pigment. And keep in mind, even if you use the same mix of pigment, you're going to be laying down a little extra pigment, so it's going to get darker and darker. But we're not painting inside this circle or these circles. So none of the white ones, none of these pale ones. I'm trying to work quickly, so I'm working in, like, if I put down something, I want to keep working in that wet area before it dries. I don't want to go back and ideally, because then you can get blooms and stuff. Now, what I could do is if I really wanted to add even more complexity to it, I could go in and just try to clean up a little bit. My circles, I can create some shadows. I can even create some dimension within each of these. So like this is white, but I could add some shadow around the edge to show it's more sphere as a flow as opposed to, two-dimensional. So we're trying to take a two-dimensional piece of paper and create images that have 3 dimensions. So let me just play with that since we have some time. And as I think about this process, it might just make sense. And maybe some of you have already figured this out, but I'm thinking, probably would make sense to do all the light, all the top layers and then kind of work your way down that way rather than, moving across one by one, because then you're using the same values.